All right, let's jump right in, shall we? We're doing a deep dive today into a real WWII mystery.
A mystery that could, rewrite history.
Exactly. You shared some fascinating sources about this, the disappearance of Lancaster RA508, a Royal Air Force bomber,
Vanished without a trace?
over the North Sea way back in 1945.
Yeah.
And, decades later, it seems like whispers and rumors have turned into some pretty tantalizing clues. And it's all thanks to one researcher.
Dedicated researcher.
Really, yeah.
What's captivating about this is, we're not just talking about a missing plane. We're talking about 7 crewmen.
7 crewmen, their families.
The families who never stopped searching for answers.
And the sources you provided really paint a picture of this mystery that starts on a very specific night, March 12th, 1945.
Fateful night.
Over 1,100 RAF bombers took part in this massive raid on Dortmund.
Key industrial center for the German war effort.
And RA508 was one of only 2 bombers lost that night. Officially, he went down in the North Sea.
Right.
But Manfred Weichert,
our researcher.
Yeah, the researcher we mentioned.
He believes otherwise.
He does, yeah. So how did his journey begin?
Well, it began quite unexpectedly. He was doing some research in Cologne and came across these partially burned RAF maps.
Partially burned. Interesting.
Yeah, tucked away in a town archive. And it turns out that these maps were salvaged from a crash site in Radevormwald, Germany.
Okay.
Miles from where RA508 was supposed to have gone down.
Salvaged, you say? That sounds like a story in itself.
It is a story. Enter Friedhelm Brack, local historian, who was just a teenager in 1945. Imagine, stumbling across plane wreckage as a kid must have been quite an adventure. And he collected ammo, signal cartridges, and, crucially, those maps. He always believed the wreckage belonged to PB-187.
PB-187.
The other bomber lost during the Dortmund raid.
Oh, okay, so the maps were found miles from where RA508 was supposed to have crashed. Is it possible PB-187 went down in 2 different locations? I mean, is that even...
Well, that's the thing. Records confirm that PB-187 crashed over 30 miles away from where Brack found the maps.
Okay.
And that, combined with eyewitness accounts describing a 4-engine plane, like the Lancaster going down in Radevormwald, makes RA508 the only plausible explanation.
So the maps, eyewitness accounts, all point to RA508 crashing in Radevormwald. What happened to the crew then? After all this time, could they still be there?
The wreckage was most likely scrapped after the war. A common occurrence, unfortunately. But the fate of the crew is even more, chilling. Accounts say their remains were buried in a bomb crater and simply covered over. It's a grave without a name.
Wow.
And it is possible the remains are still there today.
That's a haunting thought. So what makes Weichert so confident about RA508 being the plane that crashed near Radevormwald? Is there something specific about the maps that links them to this particular bomber?
Well, one of the recovered maps has handwritten annotations, possibly made by the navigator, Herbert George Harding. And if Weichert can locate a sample of Harding's handwriting, maybe a letter or a diary entry, he could compare it to the annotations.
So you're saying that handwriting, a detail like handwriting, could be the key to unlocking this whole mystery?
It could potentially confirm the crash site with near certainty.
It's incredible to think that a detail like that could be so crucial after all these years.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
But even if he can confirm the crash site, I mean, what does that mean for the families of these lost crewmen? After all this time, is closure even possible?
Well, that's a question we can explore further, but first let's delve into the story of Ken Haw,
Okay.
whose uncle, Flight Sergeant Kenneth Robert Haw, was a crew member on RA508.
Okay, so what happened to Kenneth Robert Haw? Did his family ever learn what happened to him?
Well, Ken shared that his aunt, Queenie, Kenneth's sister, she never really recovered from that day. She watched him ride off on his bicycle to his final mission, never saw him again.
Wow, that's a really heart-wrenching image. You mentioned that if this crash site is confirmed, it could bring a sense of closure to families like Ken's. But wouldn't it also reopen old wounds after all these years? I mean, how do you think about that?
Well, it's certainly a complex mix of emotions. For many families, not knowing the fate of their loved one can be just an agonizing burden to carry. Imagine the decades of wondering, of unanswered questions. And confirmation, even after all this time, it offers a chance to finally grieve, to honor their memory in a very, tangible way.
Yeah, to have something real to connect to.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that the impact of war reverberates through generations. I mean, these families have lived with this mystery for so long.
And it's not just the Haw family. The sources you shared included a pretty compelling account from John Fricker, the nephew of pilot Frank Baker.
Oh, right. Yeah.
He's been dedicated to piecing together his uncle's story for decades.
Yeah.
Fricker acknowledged the heroism of the crew, while also recognizing the complexities of the Dortmund raid itself.
Yeah, that was a major operation. Can you tell us a little bit more about the significance of that raid? Was it a turning point in the war, or, I mean, why was Dortmund such a strategic target?
Well, the Dortmund raid was part of a larger Allied effort to cripple German industry and infrastructure in those final months of the war.
Okay.
And Dortmund was a vital transportation hub and a center for coal and steel production.
Ah, I see.
So the raid aimed to disrupt those industries, hindering Germany's ability to wage war.
So while the raid was intended to hasten the end of the war, it inevitably came at a cost, right? You mentioned Fricker recognizing the complexity of the situation.
Exactly. While aiming for, key industrial targets, these large-scale bombing raids, they often resulted in civilian casualties.
Right.
And Fricker's perspective really highlights the moral dilemmas inherent in war.
Yeah.
That difficult balance between achieving military objectives and the human cost.
There's a very poignant quote from Fricker where he says, "They were brave men doing a difficult job."
It really speaks volumes, doesn't it?
It does.
Acknowledges their sacrifice, their duty, but also recognizing the very difficult circumstances of war. He's grappling with a legacy that is both heroic and tragic.
Yeah, and it brings us back to Weikert and his quest. I mean, if the handwriting analysis confirms the crash site, it could potentially lead to the recovery and identification of the crew's remains, allowing them to, finally be laid to rest with the honor they deserve.
It's a powerful thought. And it speaks to the importance of researchers like Weikert. Their dedication can bring closure to families and really enrich our understanding of history. It's amazing to think how this investigation was sparked by something as seemingly insignificant as a set of partially burned maps.
Yeah, it highlights how even the smallest detail can have a ripple effect across time, connecting us to the past in such profound ways. What resonates with me is how this story, sparked by, my curiosity, has brought the human element of this historical event to the forefront. It's a reminder that behind every wartime statistic, behind every historical record, there are real people.
Real people with families.
With families and stories.
And stories.
Yeah, in this case, it demonstrates how the past continues to shape our present, doesn't it?
It does. It encourages us to consider the lasting consequences of events like the Dortmund raid, both on a global scale, but also in the lives of individuals and families.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in preserving these stories and ensuring that they're not forgotten. But this deep dive leaves us with a lingering question, I think. Will the mystery of Lancaster RA508 be fully solved? Will handwriting analysis finally offer peace to the families after all these years?
That remains to be seen. But regardless of the outcome, Weikert's dedication and the stories of families like the Haws and the Frickers, they've really shed light on a forgotten corner of history and reminded us of the profound human impact of war.
We've explored the evidence, we've considered the impact on the families, we've delved into the ethical complexities surrounding the Dortmund raid. But what does this all mean for our listener, the one who's joined us for this deep dive? What's the takeaway from this story that transcends the specifics of World War II history?
Well, I think the story of RA508 offers this compelling look at how history isn't just about dates and battles, it's about individual lives and legacies,
It really prompts us to consider that enduring search for identity and belonging.
Yeah, it's like for the families of these lost crewmen locating their final resting place, it would be a way to reclaim a piece of their own family history.
It's about honoring their memory, providing a place for grieving, and finally, having some answers after all these decades of uncertainty. Exactly, yeah. And for Weiker, for the researcher, there's a sense of purpose in uncovering the truth and giving a voice to those who were lost. It's like he's become a guardian of their memory, ensuring that their sacrifice isn't forgotten.
He has, absolutely.
But, we've talked about the families, we've talked about the researcher, but what about us, the listeners? What can we take away from this deep dive into the mystery of RA508?
I think it reminds us that history isn't just something we read in textbooks,
Right.
It's alive, and it's woven into the fabric of our lives.
Yeah.
It encourages us to think about our own connections to the past and the events that shaped our world.
We're all part of a larger narrative, and sometimes it takes a bit of digging to uncover those connections and find our place within that story.
That's a great point. It's like we're all archaeologists,
Yeah.
uncovering layers of time and piecing together these fragments of history, both personal and collective.
Yeah, and who knows what we might find if we start looking. Perhaps there are forgotten stories tucked away in our own attics or in local archives, just waiting to be rediscovered.
You've hit on something really important here. This deep dive has shown us that history is full of surprises,
It is.
and even seemingly small details can unlock these incredible stories.
They can.
It encourages us to be curious, to ask questions, and to explore the world around us with a fresh perspective.
So to our listener, if this story has sparked your own curiosity, if it's made you think about the mysteries in your own world, don't let that feeling fade. Go explore, do some digging, and see what you discover. You might be amazed by the stories you uncover, the connections you make, and the ways in which the past continues to shape the present.